Janet Trunkel will make history next year when she takes over as the chair and CEO of EY and becomes the first woman to lead a Big Four firm. It's a story of great persistence and a remarkable journey of 33 years from being an intern to taking the top job at the firm. A heroic rise and not one without struggle. In the early days of her career, Janet often felt conscious of being the lone woman in a room filled with men, a feeling still shared by women on all rungs of the corporate ladder around the world and in India. Women occupy only 19% of corporate jobs, but the startup ecosystem gives us some hope. 35% of the Indian startup workforce is now female. That's as per ACT's Women in India Startup Ecosystem report. And with timely and targeted action, representation of women in startups can rise to 50% by 2030. While the motivation for women to work at startups is not very different from that of men, with both preferring to accelerated learning and advancement, the fast pace of work and innovation as key drivers, women also say they find it easier to break the proverbial glass ceiling at startups when compared to the corporate sector. Having said that, just 18% of Indian startups are led by women, and 17% of India's billion-dollar startups have a woman co-founder. In fact, the gender gap widens after the 10-year mark at startups. 8 out of 10 men occupy director-level positions or higher, compared to only 5 in 10 women. So are we doing enough to level the playing field, and what are the best practices India's startups need to adopt as they commit to gender parity? Hello and welcome to Young Turks, India's longest-running show on startups and entrepreneurship. I'm Shereen Bhan. Joining me are 3 women who are leading from the front in turning the ecosystem into an equal opportunity employer. With me, Suman Gopalan, Chair of the Advisory Council ACT for Women. Also with me, Supriya Paul, the co-founder and CEO of Josh Stocks, and Aakanksha Gulati, Director at ACT Grants. Supriya, Suman and Aakanksha, many thanks for joining us here on Young Turks. Suman, I'm going to start by asking you about the progress that we have made, and the data clearly does indicate that. We've been speaking periodically since ACT was set up to try and catalyze this change as far as the Indian startup ecosystem is concerned and move towards greater gender parity. What do you believe has worked so far?
First of all, Shereen, thank you so much for having us. It's wonderful to be back on your show. And I know this is a topic that is so close to your heart. So great to be having this discussion. I think since the time we started ACT, right, one of the things we wanted to shine the light on is the participation of women in startups, because we firmly believe that startups, by nature of the kind of company they are, the kind of environment they have, and the fact that they're starting ground up, have a greater propensity for fostering inclusion and diversity as a part of their culture. And so it's much easier for women and for companies to actually foster diversity in startups. But as always, you know, there is only so much that conventional wisdom takes us. So we wanted to start with data and really shine the light on, A, what is the status today? And 2, understand what are the drivers and what are the motivations. And WISER has been eye-opening in that sense. Yeah. And I know we're going to delve into that deeper. But definitely in terms of what women want or what are the biggest drivers, you'll find that it is so refreshing to see that it's not what conventional wisdom tells us, which is, you know, flexibility, more leave, all of that. In fact, women want accelerated careers. They want equal role in decision-making. And startups are a wonderful place to make that happen, because they usually look for great talent and generally leave everything else by the wayside, whether it's tenure, experience, age, you know, prior ability to do things, all of that. So startups, I think, are really breaking a lot of norms and helping really lay a different path for women to shine. And that's what we're very excited about.
Well, you know, and that's the point that you make, that the data is indicating that something is working for the positive, for the better, as far as the Indian startup ecosystem is concerned. As someone was pointing out, as per the data, 35% of total startup workforce in 2022 is represented by women. 17% of India's 100-plus unicorns are led by women. 18% of India's 90,000-plus startups are led by women. Of course, there's a long journey to cover, distance to to go, but the data certainly seems to indicate that things are moving in a positive direction. Aakanksha, I want to come to you and understand what we just heard there from Suman. This business of the fact that startups actually provide an environment which is as equal opportunity as one can hope for, as one would like to be able to enjoy. And that seems to be propelling more women to opt for the startup ecosystem versus a regular corporate job. Now, in your experience with the way that startups are operating, the measures in place today, how does this 35% become 50%? Which is the aspiration? Which is the target by 2030?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think I want to highlight both the truth and what the hope is, right? So the truth is that today's startups are at 35% women, which seems like a great starting point compared to the 19% that traditional enterprises and corporates are, right? So like Suman said, that's an advantage that we have. I think one word of caution there, though, is that was that really done intentionally? Was that a managed outcome, or was that an unmanaged outcome, right? And I think at this point, we have to kind of, in all fairness, say that, look, part of that could have also just happened by accident, right? Startups are new, younger organizations, looking out for talent, building new organizations from scratch. And so therefore, that's allowed, more younger people to come in. And typically, in the younger workforce, we see more women as well. And so that could have been an unmanaged outcome as well, right? So that's the current reality where we are, right? Having said that, startups are still mimicking some of the same trends that we've seen globally for decades across corporate, right? Which is that today in India, at entry levels, you'll see, 38% women in startups, 37% in corporate. So not very different. And then, things start changing. And by senior level, CXO, CEO level, we see 5% in corporate India versus 18% in startups, right? So startups are healthier, but what will it take, to your point, to get to, that larger North Star, which is equity? And I think this pattern, Shereen, is one that we have to be really, really careful of, which is that even though we're starting at a healthier mouth of the funnel, we do see the same trend where it's really advancement where women start, falling behind. And just 10 years into their career, even in startups, like you said, we see 8 out of 10 men have, made it to director positions or higher versus only 5 in 10 women. So one key critical thing that we really have to now double down on is how do we advance more women, right? And to Suman's point, this was counterintuitive because when we started work, we thought, there'll probably be a very methodical way of doing this. First, we fix entry. If we get 50-50 at entry, then we fix, how women retain mid-level, emerging, and senior. That's, by and large, we're finding that it's not going to be the key lever, right? If we really want to shift the equation, we almost have to go top down. And that's where some of the counter evidence is really, really pushing our thinking. Because while overall we're seeing, 35% women in startups, and that number starts again showing that pyramid structure. If you see women-led startups, so startups that are led at least one female founder or more, you're seeing, almost 45% women overall. You're seeing 2 to 3 times more women in leadership positions, right? So that tells us that it's possible. And then when you start peeling the layers, some of the levers and enablers become more real. And again, the big highlight there has been that it's just not standalone initiatives or one-odd policy. That's the magic wand, right? It's actually really something magical that's happening at the DNA level, both in women-led startups as well as startups that have moved closer to equity. That's overall moving the needle for women. So I'll just pause there for now to answer your question.
That's an important point that you make, that while we're seeing, at least at the base of the pyramid, a much healthier foundation, but the same problem exists as we move higher up the pyramid, where the pipeline gets slimmer and slimmer. But it is different, or at least relatively different, when we talk about women-led startups. And Supriya, clearly, as Aakanksha and Suman were both pointing out, it helps to have a woman on top. So I want to understand from you, what is the percentage today today of women at Josh Talks in senior positions, in leadership roles. Have you done something differently to encourage more women to elevate to leadership roles as a woman founder?
Perfect. So I think, even when I came across the report and read the data, I was pleasantly surprised. But what genuinely attracted me was the stat around how the organizations that are led by women founders have more women represented. And it makes complete sense, because even if you look at, how our aspirations are driven, we tend to emulate who our role models are. I was having a conversation with an IAS officer recently, and she said that when women wear a uniform, it changes the entire society. And you see that in the next batch, there are more women who want to give the UPSC exam. And similarly, if you see more women who are entrepreneurs, who are leading companies, there is this aspiration that gets struck even at an early age, and people do want to join that organization, especially young girls. But, just like we're talking about corporates, even what is happening at Josh right now is, if you look at the entry level, the ratio that we have currently is 56% female, and the remaining is men. Even at a mid-level manager or a senior manager level, the ratio is, say, 50-50. But when we go to senior leadership, we have about 3 women out of 8 total people who are, say, L1. And that happens because of, how our life cycle sort of moves forward. And I've realized that it's this time period of 28 to 32 where there is, huge sort of attrition that happens among women. And what we've been able to do to solve for that is just create a safe space for conversation. Sometimes it's not about flexibility, it's not about ownership, it's just about hearing the problems that people are going through and knowing that you have a manager or you have a leader who's willing to listen to you and create that safe space for you and actually help you grow. And that has been, it's sort of just like a club or a community where people just come together and, just talk about their stories. And that has had a more positive impact than any kind of structured program or mentorship program that, we've tried to run in the past.
Suman, I want to come back now and talk about the holistic approach that Aakanksha was also speaking of. That, by tinkering with one policy, by allowing flexible hours or making that just the sort of fulcrum of your policy may not necessarily be the answer. So what do you believe within the organizations that you have worked with the organizations that have been surveyed, what is working? What are the practices that are working in retention and ensuring that women can actually rise up to leadership levels?
Sure. First and foremost, I think more than practices, the one thing that has the greatest impact is actually the culture you create. This whole concept of inclusion and diversity has to be built into the fabric of your DNA, as Aakanksha said. And as part of Wiser also, as we were researching some of the best companies, we found that the top 10 or 20% in terms of women's participation, those companies inherently had it as part of their practices, right? It wasn't just one thing they did or 2 things they did. Of course, they all had different practices and policies in place. But even beyond that, fundamentally, there was a culture of inclusion. And predominantly what happens is when you have that, that pretty much drives everything that you do, right? And that's really what helps in advancement of not just women, actually all forms of diversity. Whether you look at age, whether you look at any kind of diversity. So I think culture trumps any policy or practice any day when it comes to having the right kind of environment, diversity, all of that. The second thing I would say is, of course, we just talked about how important it is to have women in decision-making roles and across leadership. Otherwise, what happens, and what I have seen in companies I have worked for, and we just spoke about E&Y and they're getting a new woman CEO, is you have a single definition of success. A lot of times we put in place, criteria or judgment criteria for talent, which is not fundamentally based on any scientific way of looking at it or any research, but it's really based on successful people in your company and what do they do, and most often it's all men. So which is why if you have more men and women in leadership, you find that your judgment criteria for success and progression is a lot more even. Then the bigger thing I would say, for every decision making, you need to have a more diverse group of people who do it, whether it is hiring, whether it's promotions, whether it is, fundamentally business decisions. And you'll find that your outcomes are a lot more inclusive that way. Just in general, it's not because of some policy or practice, right? It's just how the company operates. And so fundamentally, I'll say is, yes, policies and practices are very important, but even more important is leadership and culture. It has to be part of everyday decision-making and way of working.